Hey guys, let's make some animated fire using geometry nodes. The first thing we're going to need is an animated character. I got this knight from Sketchfab, so you can go to the links in the description and you can download that. It's free to use. So download it and rig it up and animate it. Then distribute some points on faces using the distribute points on faces. Because the area of the faces change when the mesh deforms, we're going to see the number of points change through each frame. To fix that, we're going to bake the first frame before we distribute points, but baking is going to create a problem where the points no longer follow the animation of the character. To fix that, we have to transfer the animation of the character back to the points. To do that, we're going to need the ID of the nearest face to the point. And you can see here I'm using the baked mesh instead of the animated one because the animated one is going to move away from the point, changing the nearest face. So when you bake, the nearest face is always going to be the same, which is exactly what we need. Now the next thing is to transfer the animation to the nearest point using the sampled index. Since we already have the index of the closest face, we can get the animation from the original mesh that is not baked. Use the sample index to sample the position of every face on each frame and transfer it to the point with the same index. Next up is to replace the points with a grid, and you can move it up a bit so that its center sits on the surface of the faces. Next up, let's align the orientation of the grids to always face the active camera. You can add an active camera and subtract its location from the current position of each point and use align rotation to vector and connect it to the instance on points node. That way the grids always face the camera. You might have to play around with the axis to get the right orientation. Now let's randomize the scale of the grids by using a random value. If you don't like the random value, you can also try using the noise texture, which will give you more control over the randomization. You can also add a color ramp to add more contrast between the big and small values. Because the noise texture uses object coordinates and our object is deforming, you'll see that some grids are scaling up and down. And the reason for that is because as the mesh is moving up and down or deforming, it's going through the different parts of the noise, giving us different scales. To fix that, we need the coordinates of the mesh when it's not deforming. So let's go to the baked version, store the coordinates, which is basically the position, we call it position, and use that as the new coordinates. And you can see that fixes the issue. Next, we need to save a UV map for the grid, so UV unwrap and store it under UV. It should be a vector 2D stored on the face corners if you want cycles to recognize it. You might want to change the rotation of the fire, so you can add a rotate rotation between the align and rotation. Changing the x-axis can reduce on the intersecting, and changing the z can change the direction. Before we move on to materials, let's create a mask that will soften the edges of the grid. We're going to use a gradient texture, change it to spherical, and add position as the coordinates. To preview the gradient easily, you need to increase the subdivisions to something like 12 and add a color ramp for contrast. Now you can add a vector math to move the gradient until it is centered. You can also use the scale to scale down the size of the gradient. Just make sure it is in the center of our grid. Let's set up a material, assign it to the node. Now when we go to that material, we're going to use a noise texture. You can even add a color ramp for contrast. This is going to be the base or foundation of our fire. We're going to use transparency and an animation shader mixed together and use the noise texture as the factor. If you're using Eevee, you can go into the render method and change it to blended. To animate the noise, add texture coordinates and separate the X and Y component of the location and animate the Y component. You can add a value and give it a driver hash frame to animate the value by the current frame. It's going to be too fast, so you can add a math node, set it to multiply and multiply it by something very small. the fire is going to be going in the wrong direction. So multiply this again using a -1 to move it in the opposite direction. We need to soften the edges of our grid by using the gradient we created previously. So let's go back to geometry nodes, and I can see that I didn't store it here. So let me use another store node, call it grad, set this mask as the value. Now when we go back to the shader editor, I can use the attribute node, and if I preview this, you can see we get the gradient. What I have to do is use the mix node and mix these two masks. I can set this to multiply. That way we have a softer gradient. And now this is going to be our mask. To make it look more like fire, increase the distortion level of the noise, stretch the noise coordinates on the Y value, and add another color ramp that you can color with fire colors connected to the emission. You can always go back to the geometry nodes, increase the scale and other settings to create more variation. If you want each frame to be a different speed, you can go back to the editor and adjust the X coordinates of the noise texture. But this time using the object info to create a random value for each instance of the grid. If you connect this to the X and use a math node set to multiply, you can change the position of the noise. You can randomize the position of the noise, which will randomize the fire a bit. You can also create a random value for the speed of the frame so that each frame is slightly random. You can also use a map range so that the range is not too big. Something like that. And the rest is just adding some finishing touches like ambers, lighting, and everything else. If you want a complete version without fully built UI, you can go to Patreon or my Gumroad page. It's also a great way to support the channel. With this, you can also switch out the collections for something different. And you can also just use text object. That will also work. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. If you want to learn more geometry nodes, you can check out my other courses, the Master Geometry Nodes course, the Blender Advanced Effects course, and other courses listed in the description. If you want to get the project files, it's going to be on my Patreon page and my Gumroad page. Thank you and see you in the next video.